We live in Noblesville, Indiana. As was mentioned before, I graduated from Purdue University. Yes, I'm a Boilermaker. 1974, the BS degree in professional pilot technology and a master's degree in business. I'm a commercial pilot, and I fly business jets. I always tell everybody Warren Buffett's my boss because he owns the company that I fly for. Brenda and I have 3 children. Megan, 31 years old. She's a 3rd grade teacher in Tampa, Florida, and has recently, in May, gave us our first grandchild, Joey. And let me tell you, for you folks who are not grandparents yet, it is wonderful, the experience to be a grandfather, especially at Christmas time. Eric's 25 years old. He's a business manager down in Raleigh, North Carolina. He lives down there with his wife. And Kristen, which is why Brenda and I are here this evening. Kristen was 23 years old. She graduated from IUPUI with a business degree and a double major in human resources and management in May of 2007. She just opened a new and exciting chapter in her life, fresh out of college, a promising career with Walgreens in management, and then the very next month her right ankle swelled up. And we spent the next year fighting stage 3C cervical cancer caused by HPV. As mentioned before, I wrote a book called Love Kristen to share Kristen's courageous story. She never lost her faith, she never lost her sense of humor, or her will to fight. Kristen's own journal entries, our email updates to friends, and her poetry provided the framework to tell her story. We also wanted to relate Kristen's experience with the medical community, the compassion and support of the doctors, the nurses, the medical staff, the pharmacists, physical therapists, the transporters, the EMTs were unwavering throughout her illness. Everyone took part in Kristen's battle like supporting soldiers. They encouraged us, they hugged us, they cried with us, they ate meals with us, they celebrated the small victories with us, and ultimately they grieved with us. They were guardian angels in Kristen's year-long journey and soldiers in her war. What stands before you is a very reluctant author. I never intended to write a book. My son Eric was dealing with his grief by going through Kristen's belongings for us out in the garage one day. And he came into the house and said, "Dad, you need to come here and see this." By the look on his face, it was pretty serious. I followed him out to the garage. In the middle of the garage was a chair that he'd been sitting in, and around him was Kristen's belongings he was going through. And he pointed to a stack of journals, 17 journals that had been written by Kristen. I was surprised and amazed. I had no idea my daughter was such a dedicated writer. I took the stack of journals in my office and spent the next week on the road reading all 17 of these journals. She'd been writing them since she was 12 years old. 2 were full of poetry and song lyrics because she played the cello and the guitar. And 2 were about her last year, her fight against cervical cancer. At the time, Kristen had a little 5-year-old friend named Jacob, who the book is dedicated to. He was the son of her best friend, Jeff, and she loved him like a son. I thought it might be a good idea to put together a story about Kristen in a 3-ring binder with some pictures so he could read it when he was old enough to understand who this person was, this Kristen, who loved him so much. After reading her story, a good friend of mine, Ward Degler, who happens to also be here this evening, he's an author also, he said, "You should consider making this a book." So I did. And I do have a few copies back there, but don't get me wrong, I'm not here to sell books. I'm here to tell you Kristen's story. The book has become the calling card of our foundation. The writing experience taught me how Kristen's life's journey, and especially her battle with cervical cancer, touched so many lives. We launched the book in March of 2009, exactly 9 months after we'd lost Kristen. There's now 1,100 copies in circulation. I've done a couple of radio interviews, several TV interviews about fight against HPV and cervical cancer. Kristen's experience has been published in the Oncology Nursing Society's monthly magazine. It was part of a case study about cervical cancer. Several University of California campuses have used Kristen's story in some of their lecture series. This is much more than we could have ever dreamed of. When you lose a child, your mind starts searching for answers as to why. Why Kristen? Why now? Because of our personal beliefs in Kristen's too, we know we will see her again someday. Perhaps my next door neighbor, who's a doctor and was right, when he said, Kristen and your family have suffered and sacrificed, so many others will not have to suffer and sacrifice. If you or any of your loved ones get HPV, I can tell you right now, it will be a life-changing event. In spite of these figures that the National Cancer Institute quotes about the frequency of HPV infections and cervical cancer, only 40% of American women have heard of the human papillomavirus, known as HPV. Only 20% of them have heard it's linked to cervical cancer, and only a few of those know about its link to oral, neck, and throat cancers, like Dr. Brown was saying earlier. To give you a really good example, I'm a commercial pilot. I fly business jets. I was up in Boston a couple weeks ago, sitting in the pilot's lounge working on some foundation things. I had a whole bunch of papers out that said cervical cancer on it, and a couple pilots came in from one of our other airplanes, and one of the pilots drifted over and saw I was working on it. He says, what's your connection with cervical cancer? So I told him Kristen's story. He says, you need to talk to my flying partner over here. His sister-in-law is dying of cervical cancer. So he came over and we chatted. I told him Kristen's story, talked a little about HPV. He had no idea what HPV was, never heard of it. Obviously didn't know anything about the tie between that and cervical cancer or any other cancers. We have a lot of education to do, folks. These medical people know a lot about it. They're in it and out of it all day long. We're not. There's a lot of people out there who still do not understand in Indiana what this is all about. We have a major education process ahead of us. Thankfully, companies have invested millions of dollars in research to develop tests also to detect cervical cancer or HPV. The opportunity to supplement the PAP test with HPV testing is a wonderful development and will save lives. Our daughter Kristen said she had a PAP test just 18 months prior to a stage 3 diagnosis. If Kristen and doctors had known she was infected with HPV, 16 or 18, they probably would have kept a closer eye on her. If someone had told Brenda and I in 2006 that a vaccine was available, I can tell you right now, Kristen probably would have been in line for it. But that's too late. The HPV vaccines that have been approved by the FDA now for, like Dr. Brown said, females from 9 to 26 and recently males also. I wonder how many of you understand that Australia has already vaccinated 87% of their 11 and 12-year-old females, which statistically, I'm not a statistician, I understand is almost 100% protection. They did that back in, I think, 2006 through about 2008. There are now, I think, 10 or 11 countries that offer the HPV vaccine for free to anybody who wants it. Like has been quoted earlier today, the U.S. has only fully vaccinated about 32% of its young ladies. Why the difference? I'm not really sure, but I know that Indiana's vaccination rate needs to be significantly improved. So instead of being in the bottom 5, I'd rather see it in the top 5, because Rhode Island has probably the leader right now with 73% of their females having gotten at least 1 dose of the vaccination. That's huge. That's like over twice our rate. So we need your help. We really need your help, all of your help. So what's Kristen's family doing to battle HPV and cervical cancer? It's kind of exciting because when the book came out, we established a website for just the book. Within the first year, the book's website was live. It was visited by 8,600 unique visitors from over 74 countries. So this is a global problem, obviously. We've also created the Kirk Forbes Eve Foundation. Eve not only being for the first woman, but also standing for Educate and Screen, Vaccinate and Eradicate. Its mission is to help eradicate cervical cancer, and significantly reduce HPV infection levels. We hope it'll continue to educate all women and men by some of our collaborations about HPV, the HPV tests that are available, the HPV vaccines, and cervical cancer. Last year, like Dr. Zimmett was talking about, we joined the Cervical Cancer Free America group led by Dr. Jennifer Smith out at the University of North Carolina's Gilling School of Public Health, and joined this group, which was generously funded by a grant from GlaxoSmithKline. Over the past year, we've had our Cervical Cancer Free Indiana kickoff meeting, which was back in March. We received a letter of support from all of the female legislatures here in Indiana last year, which is really exciting to get. To raise the visibility of HPV and cervical cancer, last spring we ran 13,000 30-second spots on Comcast TV statewide. We exhibited at several health fairs and did some other meetings trying to improve the educational levels. And like Dr. Kane said, we now have PSAs running in almost, if you go to a movie right now, you're probably going to see Kristen and hear about and see Dr. Kane and Jeanette Pullen, because it's running 34,000 times over a 12-week period that started back when Twilight was premiered. We had to tie it to that one, but so we're hoping an audience of almost 700,000 people see that PSA. Ultimately, cancer will touch everyone in this room. It could be you, your spouse, your brother, your sister, your mom, your dad, your friend, your neighbor, or your daughter. Cancer does not discriminate or care if you're female or male, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, or anyone else. That is why Kristen's story is everyone's story. That is why all of you are invited to join our team to eradicate cervical cancer. God has given us the way, but we now must do the legwork to educate and screen, vaccinate, and eradicate this horrible, life-changing illness. Our goal is someday to lift our glasses in a toast when the CDC announces that cervical cancer has gone the way of polio, measles, smallpox. Gone. We have the tools to eradicate cervical cancer and significantly reduce HPV infections through testing, screening, and vaccines. Now, we just need to get out there and get the job done. Thank you.